record, but how often are students taught this in school? Never. It's not like they're taught it a little, or once in a while they hear about this. They never hear it. They never hear it. I've never seen a Western civilization textbook that takes note of this phenomenon. Not one. And believe me, over many an anguished night when I was a professor in New York, I would search through Western Civ textbooks, one after the other. Which one of these can I assign in good conscience? And it was hard to find any. So what I wound up having to do, in case you're wondering, is assign a not-so-good textbook, but then also assign my own How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization. And I took some comfort in knowing that, okay, maybe the students won't read my book, but these are the same students who won't read the textbook either. And so one encouraging thing about the fact that we live in a world in which students don't read is that they won't be reading the propaganda either. And so it'll be easier for me to de-brainwash them, because they won't be reading anything. They won't be reading anything to contradict that. They'll actually finally get to hear the truth for a change, unmediated. But consider now some more specific examples of Jesuits and their achievements. We have only a minute before we have the break, but let's consider Father Giambattista Riccioli was the first person to calculate how fast a freely falling body accelerates to the ground. Surprising, isn't it? Father Francesco Grimaldi first discovered and named the phenomenon of the diffraction of light. Now, Father Francesco Grimaldi, you may be thinking about pasta sauce, but that's Francesco Rinaldi, and I'm sure Francesco Grimaldi would be appalled at that sauce. But what's interesting about the two of them is that they worked together to produce a selenograph, which is a detailed description, or a detailed map, in effect, of the surface of the moon, depicting all the various aspects of it. And their selenograph adorns the entrance to this day to the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. These were not stupid idiots. Now, there are still other scientists we have to cover, and we'll be getting to them a little bit after the break. But for now, let's just note that it isn't just that we've got a bunch of scattered scientists here and there. It's that in practically every scientific discipline, there are priests who are involved. Not just Catholic laymen, but priests who occupy this most important vocation in the Church. So join me in a minute. Let's keep doing some myth busting. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. We've been looking today at unknown and forgotten Catholic scientists who were not simply Catholics, but who were Catholic priests. So I think this helps to overturn the idea that there is some necessary contradiction between being a Catholic and being a scientist, between the Catholic faith and scientific endeavor. Now, any one of the people that I've mentioned up to now, and whom I will mention in a moment, would make the subject of an excellent term paper or book. And yet, astonishingly little is written about these great Jesuit scientists. In fact, can you believe there is nothing in the English language, there is no systematic study in the English language of the Jesuit scientists? There's no book on the subject. So graduate students out there, here's your project. Okay, you get your job somewhere. We need you to start working on this, because this is a lost and forgotten chapter in the history of Western civilization, and it doesn't deserve to be. These men deserve better, and the Catholic Church deserves better, because we would go a long way toward overturning a lot of this mythology if people simply knew some of this information. But unfortunately, they don't. You have to be some kind of a code breaker to figure it out, to find it in the midst of all the nonsense out there in the world. And there are books on every bizarre subject under the sun, hundreds of them on everything, nothing on the Jesuit scientists, and yet it would be a work of many volumes to write this stuff. But it needs to be done. Somebody should do it. I don't want to do it. It would take too long, and I don't have time, but I want somebody to do it. It's an important project. Let's consider another Jesuit in the modern period, Father Athanasius Kircher. My confirmation name is Athanasius, so I have a certain kinship to Father Kircher. Among other things, he's considered to be the father of Egyptology. Maybe a new word, but it simply means the study of ancient Egypt. And Father Kircher is known as the father of Egyptology because of his great scholarly work, and he did that work even before we discovered the so-called Rosetta Stone, which helped us to decode and decipher the various hieroglyphic symbols. In fact, it was because of Father Kircher's work that when we did find the Rosetta Stone, scholars knew what to look for and knew how to approach the subject. He's been called the master of 100 arts, and a historian writing as recently as 2003 said that Father Kircher is one of the few people of whom it can be justly said that all knowledge was his domain. Astonishing, we've never heard of this guy. His work in chemistry helped to debunk alchemy, which was this sort of phony science that alleged that you could take base metals and somehow transmute them into gold. There were serious scientists, even Isaac Newton and Boyle, who took this seriously. And it was Father Athanasius Kircher who helped to throw cold water on it. Again, forgotten, down the Orwellian memory hole. Roger Boscovich was a Catholic priest who is known to many as the father of atomic theory. In fact, Werner Heisenberg, in the 20th century, of Heisenberg uncertainty principle fame for all you scientists out there, gave a paper in which he praised and honored Father Boscovich. And a great many other scientists have also pointed to him in the 18th century as being the father of atomic theory. He's been called the greatest genius Yugoslavia ever produced, and yet forgotten. Let's consider the study of earthquakes, seismology. The Jesuits were particularly well placed to study seismology because they had universities all over the United States and, of course, indeed around the world. So they could build up seismographic equipment at these various universities and collect data about earthquakes and then bring it all together and systematize it and examine it from a central location. So they began in the early 20th century building seismological stations at their universities across the United States. Now, let's also consider, by the way, that it was a Jesuit who wrote the very first book on seismology in the United States. The first textbook on seismology in the United States was written in 1936 by Father J.B. McIlwain. Father McIlwain, by the way, has a medal named after him. Every year, the American Geophysical Union awards a medal to an aspiring young geophysicist. And that medal is named after Father McIlwain, the great Jesuit who wrote the first such textbook in America and who also served as the president of the American Geophysical Union. For these reasons, the study of earthquakes, or seismology, has become known as the Jesuit science. Now, do people know about this? No, but should they? The question answers itself. What else did the Jesuits do, though? Sure, they were studying about earthquakes and measuring freely falling bodies and studying ancient Egypt and studying chemistry. So what have you done for us lately? Well, it so happens that from the beginning, at least from the 18th century all the way up to the present, Jesuit scientists have traveled around the world, bringing knowledge of Western science everywhere they went, to places as far off as China and India. They built up, in effect, the scientific infrastructure of a great many countries around the world, ranging all the way from Ecuador to the Philippines and beyond. Throughout South America, for example, they set up meteorological and seismological stations all over the place, which were particularly helpful obviously in predicting the weather and keeping an eye on various kinds of natural disasters. People have the Jesuits to thank for that. Now, here's a part of the history of science that's been totally forgotten. I realize the whole episode is stuff that's been totally forgotten, but this has been forgotten squared, which is the history of modern cathedrals and basilicas in Western Europe. It turns out that a good number of these cathedrals and basilicas were actually built to function not only as cathedrals and basilicas, but also to function as solar observatories. It turns out that from the 17th and 18th centuries onward, there was no better mechanism anywhere in the world, nothing more precise